Hi, my name is Benedict. Today's subject is reverb. It's one of those subjects that we kind of all feel like we know everything about. But just like compression, as soon as you start to press people on it, you find that a lot of people don't really understand how reverb works and does what it does. And I've had this problem myself for a lot of my career, 30 years in and still learning stuff about reverb. But I did have some tiny advantage over some other people. What with my father being a trained cathedral organist, he actually talked about reverb, just covering the neighbour putting their car away. He talked about reverb and the echoes and the feedback of the rooms that he was in. These rooms being, big ass stone churches. So that helped prepare me for what it is. So let's start with a sound. These are sounds that are a style of sound that's really quite sensitive to reverb, and reverb is sensitive to it. So we can change the style of this sound, the feel of this sound, quite a bit with reverb. So that's why I've chosen an FM electric piano type sound. Here's one I made earlier. So the first thing that we're prone to doing with these kinds of sounds is putting chorus on them. So what we've done now is spread it out, and here the chorus is completely 100% wet, so it is panned out left and right. This is the beginning of reverb. Hear how that sound now seems to come from around you, and I really hope you're listening to this on proper studio monitors or failing that headphones, but these things give a horrible sense, so my balances are probably going to be all wrong. But as we turn that chorus on and off, this sounds very intimate, but not like it's wrapping around us, because it's dry. We put a reverb on it, a chorus on it. It actually sounds more like it's around us. We'll come back to why that is later. Part of the reason I put the chorus on, because it just sounds nice, but also because I'm going to dispel some of the myths or the negative things that you see about types of reverbs. One of the first things that you'll be encountering is you'll be finding yourself reading things in forums or on clickbait blog posts. They're not really blogs, they're just clickbait, trying to sell you some shit. Overpriced shit normally is the agenda here. And they set up the expectation that there's good and bad reverbs. How do you define good and bad? Really? It's as stupid as saying that black people are bad and white people are good. You got black people, you got white people, but effectively they're just people. They're part of the whole gamut of peopliness. Reverbs are neither good nor bad. Some will suit your purpose better, and some will therefore not suit your purpose so much better. So let's start with a reverb. This is a reverb. Sounds nice. This sound now has space around it. It gives it a sense of character. Makes it more smooth, more mellow, and you may well be starting to think in your heads a physical location for that. depending upon what your experience is, you could be thinking of a darker room, like a jazz room or something like that. Or you may be thinking of clouds, fluffy pink clouds. But that's a little less likely, because guess what? We've used a room reverb. By room reverb, it simply means that it's some attempt to emulate what it would sound like if we took this sound, my virtual digital non-existent sound, and were actually performing it, thank you Mr. Ding, whoever you are, in a room, as opposed to not in a room. Here, having comparison now, this is very sort of, it doesn't have a space, it doesn't have a place, it's just sticky taped onto the front of our ears, as opposed to this, which now feels like it has a location, a world around that sound, which means that you start to imagine some old dude who needs a shave sitting in a jazz club, playing probably a hell of a lot better than me. Reverb does this. You'll then see other shapes. This little fella starts with a hall. So a hall generally is kind of long and looks, hall-y. So here how it's bigger, it blooms. So whilst hearing that, you're less likely to actually think of being in a room-shaped space and more likely to think of being in a defined but largish space. So, 50-foot hall, because you can hear that sense of space in the sound. And I'm doing this because you hear more of a front to back feel than a wide feel. If we take off our chorus, you can really see how it narrows down, and yet there's distance front to back. And that's nothing to do with needing 7.1 stereo or any of that kind of stuff. It's garbage. Amuses you, great. Sounds good in the theatre, but it's not necessary for music, and you don't even want to think in those terms in music, because nobody's consuming their music that way, or if they are, they're screwing up the mix that you've made anyway. So, hall. It's a large hall, so this is like a big room, and you'll notice that it's wider all round. And that sound really hangs. There's also a different sense of tone in that, because different rooms will behave differently tonally, and also pitch-wise, which I might get into later. Well, I will get into later. Large hall, and another hall. And you might be like, but why do I need different halls? You'll find you do. They have a different tone. The way the sound behaves over time is different. So remember I said the difference between a good reverb and a bad reverb is nothing other than, is it fit for purpose? So if we were to turn this into just a simple bright sound, we'll go back to here. How's that sound? pretty cacky. It's easier to blame the initial sound, but it's more a case of that this sound and this reverb don't fit together very well. This reverb, the way it's been set up, is useful for most instruments, but it's not useful for this instrument. So it sounds like shit, because the two don't become one. We've now got the profile of those sound and reverb matching each other a little bit better. If we don't have them match very well, then they feel uncomfortable. Because that's a very quick sound, we probably want a quicker, smaller room so that it's more intimate. Dry, uncomfortable. Filled it out with body. Now, if I were mixing this, obviously we've got no context here to mix this, but if I was struggling to make the main reverb, because I always use a bus reverb, because it's the smart way of doing it, if the bus reverb and the sound didn't quite go together, then I might look at doing something like this. Very small reverb, even possibly in small amounts. It's just created some space and some early reflections around this thing. Then match that to the next reverb. If we get rid of this, hear how they don't match together quite as well. So there is absolutely nothing wrong with using one reverb to drive another. Often the difference between those mythical good and bad reverbs is merely the number of taps that the reverb uses. And I'll go through and show you how reverbs are built algorithmically. I'm not really going to get into using samples and impulses and what have you for reverbs, because honestly I don't like them. It's very rare that I've used them and liked them. To me they feel like taking a Polaroid of one thing and jamming it on top of another thing. So that's kind of like having a nice looking girlfriend who then goes and tries to make herself look like somebody else who's famous on television. It actually ruins her natural beauty by trying to force herself into being something else. I use that analogy because to me that's what those impulse response things do. They can sound great, but they can also just sound horribly fake and wrong. And I know fake and wrong is probably the fashion in music these days, but nonetheless, if you want to feel organic, you'll do better with an algorithmic reverb than one that's simply trying to say, here, look, let me put a Facebook filter on the front of your sound. So back to where we were. Don't really tie together. You can hear these reverbs washing around outside, but they don't really tie together. We've now managed to bring those two together, which is the instrument sound and the room sound, by bridging them with another little reverb that suits the sound and also suits the room. So mixing tip pretty early on. So again, no such thing as a good or a bad reverb. Whereas you're going to build a reverb in a little bit and it'll start being terrible and it will improve as we go. Now the other thing that you will encounter in terms of what people call good and bad reverbs is the argument about true stereo. A lot of people will try to tell you if a reverb is not true stereo, then it's shit. Their opinions are shit because they don't know how the world works. Remember I said my dear old Da was trained as a cathedral organist, 5 manuals and pedals and stuff, and that's done in great big arse stone churches, which echo like a bastard. It's part of that sound. You hear a real pipe organ, not samples of, a real pipe organ, it's like, bugger me, because of the room. It's such a live sound. How many churches do we have? It's not a trick question. We've got one church. We've got one pipe organ, but a pipe organ, you've seen the picture of a whole lot of pipes. They're spread out across a large area. So in essence, a pipe organ is a stereo instrument. Righteous. But we've only got one church. Therefore, the room in which our stereo instrument is in is mono. Fuck! We're ruining it! And yet go whack your head in a recording, or even better if you can, into an actual church where they've got a real pipe organ, and listen to that sound. It's immense. So, people will try to say that if you haven't got a true stereo, as in the reverb affects the left-hand channel uniquely and it affects the right-hand channel uniquely, then you've got a shit reverb. No, you've got a shit mindset. Because in the real world, our stereo pipe organ is processed inside a monophonic church. Because we've only got one of the bastards, because they take so much time and money to build, all those nice little peasants being beaten to death to build them. So if you look at the little wiring diagram here, it shows that if we input only one channel, good old-fashioned mono, it will do its magic and spit it out in stereo. If we were to input a stereo signal, it'll glom it together, do its stuff, and output it in stereo. That remind you of anything? Yes, the big-ass medieval church. So this is what happens when we're in a room, and it's the same whether we're in a jazz club, a techno-dufatorium, a fiddler's hall, gone to the opera, it's all the bleeding same. So your room is always shared. So the sound that's happening in that room, the guy over there tinging his triangle, you hear him over there, but you also hear the echoes from over there, because we're in one room. Don't make the mistake that so many naive producers do of saying that, oh no, my room is different for every source, and that it has to be like big ass fucking stereo or it's not producery enough. No, you're making a big mistake. Mono reverbs that create stereo, which will show you how it happens, are superb for creating one room in which your piece happens. If you don't have your whole piece happening within ultimately one room, the mix is never going to gel, because it's a little like having conversations with several different people in a chat room, but each of those people is using a different chat room. You'd be like, why would you do that? Yeah, wouldn't you just create a group so that you can all see what each other are typing and having for breakfast? So, get rid of the idea that if it's not a true stereo reverb that it's shit. Nope. They should merge together and then create a new stereo. So the contrast of the original stereo from the raw sound and the faux stereo that comes from the room is where your magic happens. Get rid of that magic and, well, you lose magic. Pretty simple. So, different types of reverbs for different situations. Match the right ones. The basic shapes that you will see, we'll start with this guy here, small space. Let's turn him on. Sounds better that way. Now let's listen to them out here so we get a better sense of what they sound like. Because we're not judging the sound. Actually, we'll go back to my nice electric piano. We'll go 50-50. That's probably going to be easier. It's good to set up your reverbs. When I set up my reverbs, I always listen to just the reverb, so that way I can hear what I'm making. But ultimately, they have to match. So that's a very small space. It sounds like a little tin tank, as in like a coffee container, like you're inside it. Easier to say, why would we ever want one of those? Well, we're overdoing it here. Dry. Intimate, but not intimate up your nose. So little tanks are really useful, and one of the great things that we can do with them is make them move. That's overdoing it. Hopefully in your speakers you're feeling a bit like, ooh. But we can add some of that to create movement in the sound. Also, what we're doing is essentially building a resonator. Now, I've made another article on using a resonator to make a set of piano samples sound far more real, like one piano, a real piano. And that's by creating a point at which every part of that sound resonates. It starts to whine like a bastard if you overdo it. And that's a good place to start to work out if that whine is musically useful. So this adds just that little bit of space which can help transition a flat sounding instrument into a real sounding instrument. So in other words, if you have an acoustic guitar, it sounds real because you've got a tissue box that up the sound of the strings before spitting it back out into the world. So in theory, if we were to take a piano sample and whack it through the tissue box that is your acoustic guitar and push it back out to the world, it's going to develop some of the character. That's the whole logic behind those impulse reverbs and what have you. But it works better in the real world. It doesn't sound like a Polaroid snapshot. So tiny spaces, really useful for taking an instrument that seems flat and putting a unique character into it. Also good for pre-reverbs, pushing one reverb into another to make the instrument and the reverb match. Rooms. Go back up. Rooms can have different shapes and sizes. So what that is, actually I'll stop for a moment and I'll explain how reverb works. Remember, pipe organ, big arsehole church. When the organist plays a note, it sets off the pipe, blows some wind up the pipe, literally, that's what it does, which creates a fluty type sound coming out the pipe. That air wave of air goes out and hits the walls and the roof, the ceiling. Not the roof, because that's on the outside. The ceiling of this church, and to some extent the floor of it too. Seeing most parts of that whole thing were stone, then as each of the sound waves hits each of those surfaces, boing, it bounces back. Some of it's going up to the top, boing, and bouncing back. Some's going to the bottom and going boing and bouncing back. Some's going over here, and so we've got what started out as a super neat and tidy sound coming out of that pipe, hitting the walls and just going everywhere. When it hits this wall, it bounces off, and then bounces off that wall, and then bounces off that wall, and over here, and so a reverb is made up of one echo, followed by another echo, followed by another echo, followed by another echo, except it becomes exponential. So 1 becomes 3, becomes 78, becomes 27 billion little echoes, little copies of that sound flipping around in our room. If those walls, if the stone walls and the ceiling and the floor's always polished from people scruffing their ghastly little peasant feet on it, gets shiny, then every time that sound bounces back, it bounces back fairly accurately. Just like if you're walking past a shop and you look in the plate glass window, if it's nice and dark inside and it's a nice quality piece of glass, your reflections looks an awful lot like you. Hopefully with good hair. If it's cheap-ass glass, and it's like, then your reflection doesn't look quite as stunning as you are. So that's the same as if those stones in that church, cathedral, are still kind of rough, then the sound bounces back far more complexly. So just as your face in a piece of glass looks all... the sound that comes back has had this done to it, which makes it more interesting. It actually spreads out. So rather than hitting that wall and bouncing back kind of the same, it hits that wall as one and comes back as many. And that's called diffusion. So every time it hits something, the sound tends to each time. The ultimate diffusion is when you hit something like deep pile shag carpet with a nice foam backing, that it hits that and it gets so sort of broken up that virtually nothing bounces back. And then you ultimately end up with a dead room, which is that when the sound goes out, virtually nothing bounces back. Something always bounces back, but virtually nothing bounces back. And then you go, this room's pretty darn dead. So it's somewhere in between. And what happens is that each time that sound bounces off a wall or surface, like my face or my glasses, it becomes a little bit more broken up. In that process, some of that sound actually starts to become white noise, because it just gets broken beyond comprehension. Like if you look in a carnival mirror, sooner or later you'll find a point where you no longer look like you just kind of look like cat vomit. You start to look like noise. The sound as it bounces around starts to resemble noise, which is why when you listen to a reverb tail, let's get a real tail, big ass tail. It starts to sound kind of a little bit like musical white noise, because that's what it's doing, it's just creating everything everywhere. So our rooms, halls, remember they specialise in arenas are, but they're relatively unbounded. So while you think you're going to get a bigger, denser reverb, in actual fact you don't. But you can feel there's this huge sense of space behind that. That's like watching the roadie set up the electric piano for the Doobie Brothers. You know, you're miles away and this guy's playing an instrument and the instrument ends up seeming small because the rest of the space is huge. Plates. Plates were quite literally a piece of metal. Whack a speaker on one end of it to make it start to vibrate. Whack a microphone on the other end, so as the tin plate vibrates across, you record what's coming back out, mix that with the original signal, and blow me down if you don't get something that actually vaguely sounds like reverb. Now you can hear how that sounds like whacking a plate of metal. Some of the plate reverbs got pretty impressive. You know, look at sort of Abbey Road's plates and things like that, the physical plates. pretty impressive. So when you get good ones, you can get a really impressive sound out of them. When you get bad ones, they sound like a bad spring in a guitar amp. But you can get a lovely sound out of a plate because it's very dense. There's no echoes. It's just pure, and they mess up the sound quite nicely, even though they do add a bit of a metallic-y sound to them. But particularly for that sense of a reverb that you don't really realise there's a reverb there, they're super for that. So they're good for this. They can be great for strings, like you can make them really bright. Not really thinking that you're hearing a reverb there, because it doesn't sound like a room. It's not a known space, because it's not a known space, and yet the sound is thick and beautiful and glossy. So it's used a lot. It was used a lot of vocals in the 80s. I'm pretty sure Sir Cliffy Bastard, that was part of his whole, wired for sound, some people sound. Plates are beautiful when you use them right. Put them on strings and you don't get the big whir. You can just get that really lovely glossy sound from them, and you can make them real bright. Springs I spoke about before, quite literally the same method as a plate, only instead of having a flat piece of metal, you literally have a spring. Feed sound into the spring rattles like a bastard, literally, and you record what you've got outside the other side. You can hear that tank sound of we're vibrating a bit of metal inside a box. Easy to dismiss them when you listen to that. You go, oh my god, that's just like the world's worst reverb. Why would we ever use that? It's echoing, it sounds like it's drunk. Look how many hits have been made with spring reverbs. Babe, I'm leaving, must be on my way. Worked for Styx, worked for Johnny Cash. Guitar used a lot of spring reverb. So don't dismiss them because they don't immediately sound like a smooth hit making machine. They're a character reverb. And they bring me to the next stages. How the hell do you make a reverb? Yes, we could go out and get impulse responses, tap our pot in a room and record the that comes after it, and Instagram face alter our sound with it. But as I said to you before, my very firm opinion is it'll sound like shit. Even though it'll seem big and glossy, it's just putting a sheen over it. It won't sound right. So how do we make an algorithmic reverb? What's the core of reverb? Hopefully you're saying, well, Benedict, you just told me that before, so why are you asking me that? It's sound bouncing off and doing this. Cool. Good answer. Let's turn off our chorus for the moment. Sounds a bit again, doesn't it? We've done nothing but add an echo, a delay line. We picked up that sound, moved it back in time, and mixed it back in. But hear how the sound is noticeably different in feel. It's got a space. Before you start applying tons and tons of reverb to things to try to make them seem professional, look at perhaps just adding an echo. Now your echoes can go from really short to really long. My God, I sound twice as good as myself. You generally don't want to go that long, which is why plenty of echo units don't give you any more than a second. Unless you want to get into frippatronics and repeating yourself, which most people use sample looper thingies, then anything much more than about 500 milliseconds is getting into danger territory of jumbling your up. You know what I mean. So we're looking for spaces rather than echoes, so we want to go short. Anything sort of 120 milliseconds and less is in the sort of roomy type echoes. Obviously we can go out longer, but that's starting to become an effect. So we'll keep them short. Anything under 60 becomes actually hard for the brain to pick out that it is an echo. 60 and on, we can definitely pick, oh, that's an echo. Some of us are better at picking the echo than others, but nonetheless, general rule of thumb, 60 milliseconds and on, we tend to hear boom, 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 boom. 60 milliseconds and under, we tend to just hear bloom. Not a boom, but a bloom. In which case we can take advantage of that, because this is what happens in rooms. Now I'm going to create you what's called a flutter echo. That's a pretty extreme flutter echo. But if you've got a room in your house that doesn't have much in it, maybe as a spare bedroom, painted, one cardboard box in the corner, go into that room and clap your hands, which I'm not going to do here because it's going to upset the microphone. Now really listen. Put your ears up to where the ceiling, there it is behind me, meets the walls. There's corners there, and particularly the corners of the room up there. Smack the hands together, ears up to there. Listen. The more empty that room, the more you will get a coming back at you. So you'll hear this little whine, not as obvious as that, and it'll change based on... That's called a flutter echo. It's the essence of what I said earlier with a resonator. So it's just got such a short delay with so many taps, and it starts to whine. Which again, people will say, oh, but that's a sign of terrible reverb, Benedict. You've got no idea what you're talking about. You need a pro reverb. You need to be a pro producer. It's like, fuck off. You don't know what you're talking about. You obviously don't want it's not exactly Chopin, is it? But pull this back because that was excessive. Hard for me to hear because of these damn headphones, but that's too much. But we start to imprint a little bit of character, a little bit of space on that instrument. So that's that small box that we can put an instrument into, start to give it character. That's reverb. We have our guitar, our acoustic guitar with its tissue box on it. The reason that that's making the strings sound louder is because the sound's reverberating inside and it makes a warmer, more lively sound. You take an instrument that has no real world presence, give it a little bit of some. can hear it there. I will point out one of the issues with the way most effects are set up, and it's done this way for a good reason, but it doesn't always feel that way. I've spoken about this before, but when you switch in an effect like choruses and delays and what have you, is that they often reduce the overall volume of the sound, or at least the perceived volume. What they're very kindly doing is, say, our 12 dB here, the meters don't change, but what you hear changes. So sometimes we make the mistake of going, oh, but every time I add another effect, my sound gets more pathetic. It's just because you're losing 3 to 6 dB of perceived volume. The real level is the same, but perceived level, because you're now hearing half the original sound and half the created sound, put the two together and the system is going, look, I'm going to make sure that you haven't suddenly got that much sound and blow all your levels. But sometimes you're just going to want to turn the level up to compensate for that drop. Remind you anything? That's spring reverb. The difference here, however, is just that the sound is kind of static. Does that not sound nice? A little bit of done, but that is nice. A lot of delay units, they lock you into a stereo spread on the modulation side of things, on the LFO side of things. I actually don't really like that. I'd rather have control myself of the stereo-ness of that. Obviously at the mixer, decent mixer like Reason has, you can just de-stereoize things, but I'd rather have control here, because I may well want to keep my original stereo-ness and then control the stereo-ness of that reverb or echo space. Now, we do have a problem here. By putting in the modulation, we've decreased some of the staticness, or what ultimately becomes Y, by modulating. If we have like a tape wobble, we can add this. That allows us to go back into mono because we're stuck with that. But it's nice to have a bit of stereo. Even though that's an echo, it's serving the purpose of a reverb. You've obviously got to mix that in an appropriate way, and you might put that then into a reverb too, but you don't need to. You'll find you need less reverb when you've got your instrument spaces right with things like echoes. Now, next thing we can look at is filtering that sound. We can filter it bright. So even though we've got more, we can focus where we want that feel to come through. So in a mix, Our electric piano may be the whole of the mix, but it may be an instrument inside the mix, in which case we may say, look, I want to focus the perception of this electric piano into, let's say, the 3K region, which we might well want to do. We still want to have the body of it, but so Hill Street Blues, Doobie Brothers, the Styx song, any of them, they focus, they use the brightness of that. So you could do that, or we could... Yeah, that creates quite a different feel. Rather than sort of feeling bright and airy, it's now warm and dark. The next thing that we do, remember, as that sound bounces around our medieval building with the less than perfectly shiny walls, it breaks up every time it hits something. So that's what's called diffusion. We'll turn that off for the moment. You can hear each of those taps. Bap, 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 bap. If we diffuse them, bap, 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 it diffuses. So that's the hit the wall and hit the wall and so it actually creates more. And you can set how much of that happens. Oh my god, that sounds like a reverb unit. Put on our filter again. We might slow down our LFO. That's a reverb. Yes, many of you will be saying, but why would you do it that way? It sounds like shit, it's not pro, it's not like, you know, a good quality reverb, man. Again, just piss the fuck off. You know, press the stop and, you know, go listen to something on SoundCloud that is the same as everything else on SoundCloud. This is about creating your own sound and understanding how reverb works. So if you want to go out and buy the most expensive fucking reverb you can find, then you know what you're looking for, what you want it to do. And if it's a great reverb, it will allow you to do from this stuff that sounds like a flutter echo in a room, and there was plenty of that on record between sort of 78 and 80, right the way out to convincing yourself that you're in some hall in Outer Mongolia. No worries. Now, this is where we get more interesting. This is where we really separate ourselves from the kiddies who go buy something pro and those who, you know, love their craft and are looking to make something unique. We have our Now, you don't have to do this. It's not like I'm saying, oh, you're not a real man if you don't DIY your own reverb up. But by going through this process a few times, this is, you know, probably the 5th or the 10th time I've made one of these, every time I do it, I learn more about how to drive this little fella. I get better value for money out of this, rather than needing to go off and buy the something or other pro at $150 a pop, 170 I think. I can spend some time on this, and when I come back to this, I got a much better idea of something else I can do with it. $170 still in my pocket. little bit of time no longer in my life, but you know what? I've enjoyed this and I've learned something. So what have we got here? We've got 1, 2, 3, 4 delay lines. So that's this fella here, 4 times. Here's a feature of this, which actually I didn't go over, and I should go over to set you up for this. Let's minimize that. The moment, that's 1 delay line. This, like many other delays, gives you the option to offset. So you create actually stereo delays. Whoa! So you ask, well, how do we get stereo? You can do it with a little bit of LFO. That's getting into effect territory again. Or you can just offset that. If that's 150, which is quite a lot, let's drag it down to 70 something. That out to stereo. So I've made, and I'll walk you through making a really nice reverb. Using, in this case, 4 delay lines. I've made them out of 3, I've made them out of 5 and 7, I think. But the more I know about how to take advantage of my tools, the fewer I need. Which means that if I now were to add a few more, it would sound shinier. Because remember, each delay basically breaks up that sound so that it starts to sound more like noise. We like that sound. So, 1 delay line. The mixing's pretty simple, just the sound comes in. You've got to split it up so that you can send 1 to dry and 1 to each of these devices. I minimize how much they chain into each other, because while you initially think, oh, but if I nest them all inside each other, it's just going to howl like a bastard. It won't sound any good. Even though the sound does feed back into itself, so the sound from the pipe organ hits the walls, bounces back, and then those bounces do the whole same thing again. Electronically, it gets a little bit tricky to process that, so it's easier to just simply say, I'm going to send to here, and to here, and to here, and to here equally, and then just mix them back together. By all means, experiment with sending back out, but in this sort of environment, it often does more damage than good. So, caution. So we've got all of these times set to 0, not 1 millisecond. I set them to 0 if I could. But if we look at our controller here, see it says don't control anything here, delay here. In this case it goes to this, it will use 13%. This will use 25%. This will use 50%. That's up to 500 milliseconds. And this one will use, oh, it's a smaller amount. You see this one comes after these as well, so we'll get into that later. But you don't want everything to be too regular. If it's too regular, then they all end up just going boom, 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 boom together, which is part of why I hate BPM synced delays. But we definitely turn BPM off in reverbs, because there ain't no such thing as a BPM drone. So, our first 2 devices, I'll leave that open for the moment. There's my mixer here. Let's just mute that one and turn him off. So, sound familiar? I've made you a couple of those. So we're just controlling the delay time. I've set an offset. So each one of these, 1, 2, 3, 4, is actually 2 delays. So we can call it 6 in our tank, 6 taps in our tank. just controlling the one of them. We can control feedback. Obviously we don't want to overdo it. And then our modulation rate and depth, we can control those as well. And our tone, you can't see these knobs move, but remember how I showed you, you can brighten or darken the tone. Again, these don't all end up being in the same spot. Otherwise we'll create a whine. Whereas in a real room, that wall has a curtain on it, so the sound comes back a bit darker. This room one over here, people keep touching it, making it greasy and shiny, so that one comes back brighter. Somebody put carpet and Twisties packets on the floor, so it comes back a little bit more broken up and darker. No one's ever taken the cobwebs off the ceiling, so that's really broken up and got a messed up frequency. So each one of those tone controls here is different. Now those tone controls are just a band pass set to move like that, and this controls the peakiness or the width of that band. That's all those are doing, these frequency things. And you set them all so they're slightly different. Too far and the reverb doesn't gel as one room. Too close, they just whine, because all you're doing is emphasizing the very same frequencies, which whine. So I've set them reasonably broad, some here, some there, and that way your echoes as they come back have slightly different characters, but they merge. So that's our first echo. Here's our second one. We put our first and second together. Here, how just putting those two, which is really 4 taps, together getting a nice space. Now it's typical to do this, I'm just trying to show off so you can hear the individual taps and what they're made of. But it's not a productive thing, because unless your instrument happens to be this, don't use it to judge how the reverb's going to sound. The coarser the reverb, often the nicer it's going to sound on a smooth sound. Because that's got some harsh transients, we probably do want that to be shorter. Which puts us into a platey kind of a profile. But if it's a string, we give ourselves a nice open space and it sounds gorgeous, and you've got that big feel that you're looking for in those sounds. So that's just 2 of these fellas together. We bring in the third one, and the third one I have a trick, because you never do the same thing twice. As soon as you're doing the same thing more than once, then you're just creating things that pile on top of each other and will whine. Actually, no, sorry, it is the second one that we need to look at this one for. You've noticed that we've got this. It's got a reverb in the middle. Because I wanted to be able to thicken this up fairly quickly and easily without adding more delay lines, which potentially adds problems, I just added one I'd made earlier, which was to add one of these little fellas inside this. So if we would look at the wiring, it has a breakout. So within its delay loop, within its feedback loop, it sends the sound out to this reverb device and brings it back in. So each time so all we're doing is superpowering the diffusion process by putting it through a reverb. But you see the reverb has some of the original sound mixed in, otherwise it just goes, which is Kind of like dropping a can of paint in the middle of a room. It doesn't get the room painted. I've given the option to change the profile of that, so if I'm working on huge spacey sounds, then I can really overdo it. First two. The third one, as I was showing you before I distracted myself by realizing I'd done it wrong, we've just got a longer. Same thing, it's longer. One of these units I wired back in backwards. You might be like, why would you do that? You're messing up your stereo signal. Remember before, a reverb is not pure stereo, nor do you want it to be, because it sounds wrong. It sounds like you've cut yourself in half and you've got two separate rooms, one ear in each. Fucked up. Bad production work. Because it doesn't sound like it belongs as a whole. Weird ass shit. Doesn't mean you couldn't use it for a weird ass shit, scene in a film or something like that. But if you do it without people understanding why their head's been split in half, not smart. So one of these echoes I've actually wired in backwards. So I took my left and put it into the right, and the right and put it into the left. It does that mergification thing a little bit more. Obviously, listen to the results. If the results are not great, don't do it. So collectively, we'll pull out this reverb just so you know. Nothing. 1, 2. And if we just listen to this one, yeah, we can think, ooh, it's kind of tinny and icky. But how it works in the balance. You'll see I've also changed the volume of these. You could set your volumes differently to suit yourself. I've just simply set it that the longer echoes are quieter than the short ones, because that's kind of consistent with a room. Each time it bounces, it gets a little bit quieter. But if you wanted to make less of the metallic tanky sound, then you could make this quieter, this louder, and then this quieter again. Or the opposite, which is the bloom sound in a reverb. But I've done a bit of a set and forget there, because that's going to work nicely enough for what I want. And then we got this fellow on the end. I should put the reverb back in. Just turn all these off. Remember with our timings, this kept the echoes very short, a bit longer, quite a bit longer again, and then this one was in between. If we made this longer again, then it would just do this, which would be really obvious. This last one takes the sum of all of these. These are all mixed back together, including the long and the short. And then this just does essentially the same process again, only the delay time is somewhere in the middle of these guys, somewhere about here. That's short and that's long. It's somewhere about here. So it fills the holes in the middle. So remember, if the sound bounces off the walls, it comes back and goes out again. And each time it goes out, it adds more in the middle. So hear how that's really smoothed out now. We've got a fairly long time. Even with a long time, it's nice. Yes, some reverb purist will want to say, oh, but it's not perfect on the tails. Like, who the fuck's sitting there listening to tails? I mean, come on, buddy. I bet you if you looked at what I've published in the last 30 years and what you've published in the last 30 years, you've probably published quite a lot of Facebook posts about how reverb tails are ruining your career. We're never looking for perfect. Perfect is the last thing that you want. What you want is passionate, alive. Anyone now, if they released Meatloaf's Bat Out of Hell, the first record right now, is a tank. Not because it isn't as good a record as it ever was. It's a bloody brilliant record. Absolutely superb, stunning work, go to work. But it's a tank now because people would say it's not perfect, or the mix is shit. Get your hand out of your own pants, look at how much you've published in the last little while, and just hope that one day you could publish something that's like 5% as good as Bat Out of Hell. Because you're too busy looking for perfect, you need to be looking for character. So the reason that I build these reverbs for myself is one sound, that wasn't entirely a fair comparison because I didn't really compare apples with apples. That's a spring. We should be looking at a whole. Let's go back and try again. That's a nice polite reverb. Generally speaking, the RV7000 has a pretty good reputation as a good reverb. To me, that's a lovely sound. Obviously, depends on what you do with it. Up to you. Lovely sound. Plus, that's hard to do with most reverb units, so it's worth it for that alone. So, I hope this helps to understand reverb a fair bit better. Remember, reverb is nothing but an echo. Happening lots of times. Bouncing back and changing every time it bounces back. The way it changes when it bounces back is to lose some frequencies, to lose some coherence. Remember, perfect mirror, you look as lovely as I do. Less than perfect mirror, it changes the sound. And in terms of sound, when sound loses coherence, it starts to turn into noise. White noise, ultimately, that you hear on the end of reverbs. That's where the sound has started to lose coherence. And that's an important part of reverb and space for your sound. Sounds, even in real rooms, my father would talk about this with the churches. With one church he would talk about how the echo that came back from the other end of the church, because the organist is generally sitting up the front, often on one side, and an echo that would come back in one of these churches was noticeably late. In other words, you can really hear it. So it was probably 120, 150 milliseconds. The fucker was late. But it was also flat. When it came back, it had changed pitch. So this genuinely happens in rooms. They change pitch. Most rooms don't change pitch an awful lot, which is why clap your hands and they whine. But a bigger room will actually change pitch. The exact reason why I don't know, could be Doppler shift, don't know, don't care. But they do change pitch. And that gives the sense of warmth and fatness and thickness. So you can, if you're only playing with RV7000, play with that. It has the option right here. Thick, thin. It's not as obvious in the one that I've made, but it's there. So if you want to thicken your sound up, that modulation is what does that. So that's part of what gives you a sound. So if you want it to be thinner and more natural sounding, then often you go for less pitch shift inside your reverb. If you want it to get that really lovely thick sound and glossy as well, then you go for pitch shifting and possibly even pitch shifting out into the stereo field to give you what you're hearing a lot of in here. And then you just got to control how long it is. That's too long to use in a lot of places, but depends on the situation. So what's the space your piece is happening in? If you're writing something that you want to come off with an orchestral feel, notice I don't say just using orchestral samples, because while I've got them, I struggle to enjoy using them. But if you're wanting to give some of that feel, then okay, what's the space your orchestra is in? What's the scene they are painting? So you might say, well, I'm not going to worry about trying to create a room that sounds like the orchestra hall. I'm creating something about being in a cave, so I'll put my orchestra inside a cave. So I'll work out, well, what would a cave sound like? Chances are, while you've got some early stuff, you've got echo, echo, echo happening, which is fairly dark. And there's probably a bit of space between that first play the instrument and the first bit of sound coming back. So you might even go for two reverbs. One which is a bit just from the muddy walls around you, depending on how big your cave is, and then some echoes. Or you might just take a reasonably short room reverb that's kind of dull, and then put an echo unit on the back of it, so it goes whoa, 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 whoa. Up to you. Try it. Find the right space. Sometimes that means space between your initial sound and the echoes, the reverb. That's seen as pre-delay. So that means as soon as the sound starts, the reverb process starts. But if we drag it out, let's pull it back. Might be kind of artificial, but it works beautifully. Not for percussive sounds, but for we've got the immediacy of the raw sound playing without the all around it, and then we've got that coming in a bit later. Play with it. See what works for your material. Diffusion is quite simply how many taps we're using at once and how much we let them spread themselves out, how much they can, or depending upon how much you diffusionize that knob. Different shapes quite literally just show you how the they probably have different EQ curves inside them as well. Manufacturers commonly don't tell you what they've really done inside. So yeah, awesome sauce, I guess. But use your ears to work that out. And again, don't be afraid of character, because character is what's going to make your piece stand out. And if you avoid character and just go, I want to make everything sound perfect, why would somebody choose yours? Because it sounds the same as everybody else who's made exactly the same decisions as you. That's okay if you're a fish and you want to stay safe in the ball of fish. But if you're a musician wanting to be heard uniquely as little you fish, rather than just a blob, I mean, we don't wake up in the morning saying, "Ooh, I want to be known as part of the ball of fish." Really? Go back to sleep. We want to be known as Nemo. We want to be known as Dory, or Benedict, as the case may be. In which case, I need to put my character on it. So, yes, I can use one of them's reverbs, or I can make my own. Now, if you go off and make your own reverb, if you go off and make your own reverbs, your own spaces, automatically the sound profile of your music starts to become different. That's a good thing. Unless you like to be just simply part of the fishbowl, but hello fishbowl. It's not hello Benedict, hello Nemo, hello Dory, it's just hello fishbowl. And we all know what happens with fishbowls. So, don't be afraid of reverbs, and don't use them blindly. Because when you just turn them on and go, "Oh, yeah, okay, I really don't know what I'm doing, I'll just, okay, that must be right." What? The dream sequence of the deeply diseased. It's not a right or wrong sound, but it sure ain't a compelling one. So work out what it is that you're trying to tell, and then work out how to make your tool tell that thing. And then you'll find that what you're trying to tell can come across. Definitely take the time, play around with basic echo units and cascading those basic echo units together. If you're a bit frightened about, "Oh, geez, I wouldn't know how to do any of that stuff," easy. All of these are off. Some echo. Okay, bit of the old diffusionation. We've now made our own reverb unit. You can hear it come in right there. We've created now a very unique space around that instrument, which we can actually change within the mix. So I can keep the close part the same, and in a bit that's more relaxed, I can actually pull out the longer part, shunt it back for more of an obvious echo than this. Just make sure there's nothing happening, or that you've muted this before you do that, which is clever sometimes in the mix, but generally speaking, You want to be careful of it, especially if you're playing as sensitively as I do. That's all you need to do with reverbs, but think about, what am I looking to create? As long as you're not thinking about what you're looking to create other than to try to sound pro, then you're going to struggle to make sense of what this is and why it's doing it. Start piling up echo units like this and mixing them together with different timings and spreads of diffusion and frequencies and modulations. And as you see, within 2 devices, you're suddenly going to have this cool sound. And the more you play with that, and play with things that you might put in the middle, what might I put in the middle? Oh, good old-fashioned scream. Yes, this tends to make the sound a bit bright, but who doesn't like a bright sound? We'll pop it across to tape. What that's done is squashed some of this together a little bit more. Same, squishes it together a little bit more. These are the things that are done in secret inside a reverb unit like this, but you can be in control of them by putting in the time to play with them and to say, well, what happens if I do this? What do I hear come out of this? And you will stumble on things that you go, wow, that feels like this thing I want to express, and you build something around it. And keep focus on that. And when it comes to the mixing stage and the mastering stage, don't go saying, oh, but I need to smooth it off so it sounds like what everyone else tells me is pro. Tell those people to piss the fuck off, because they're never going to buy your music anyway. Make something that's unique, so that real music lovers, someone like me maybe, will come along and go, wow, that stands out. That got my attention. Just as 30, 40, whatever years after the fact, Bat Out of Hell gets my attention. I was listening to some Rolling Stones in the car yesterday, and it's like, I'm thinking, geez, these guys have been at it 50 years, but you know what? They still get my attention. Thank you. I hope this has been useful for you. You have a good day now.